Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 2 of the Consent Management Decision Enforcement Services and Computable Consent track. My name is Dwayne DeCuto. I'm the track lead and principal engineer on the LEAP FHIR consent project. Joining me as track leader is Mohammed Jafari, who is the principal investigator and architect of the LEAP consent project as well. So this session is consent management deep dive. It's geared largely for the developer community. Our objectives in this session is to basically go through the ONC LEAP projects code repository and documentation to look at this track's example consents, test messages, and testing methods. The service points that are available to us, that would be the consent decision service, the consent management UI, etc. And then we'll actually go through and exercise consent management. We'll create a patient privacy consent, an advanced care directive, a portable medical order, do not resuscitate treatment, and research consents. And then we'll actually run some of the validation tests from those consents. So the resources available to us that are kind of focused in this session is the LEAP consent UI. For you developers out there, if you're using Git, you can clone that repository at the link listed below. And then we have several test servers that we're hitting during this session. The LEAP consent UI, all of these are running inside of the San Diego Health Connect's Google Cloud. And as I noted in the previous session, that these services will be available for further investigation for roughly the next 2 years or until our operational funding runs out for the cloud services. So we've got the LEAP consent UI. We've got the consent decision service. We're running FHIR on the back end. So we've got the consent repository and the actual endpoint that we do work on, which is the FHIR base. And then our consent UI uses the security labeling service to analyze sensitivities within the patient record. So we've got a hook in there as well. So these are the services that we're using during this session. So as far as consent management goes, there's a common flow that we've implemented within our project. So there's a suite of consent management services, and they're all keying off of a questionnaire and e-signature flow where we're asking specific questions, whether they're related to an exchange of information between two clinical providers, or if we're completing a living will. In all those cases, we capture e-signatures from the patient or the patient's representative, if the patient's not capable to sign, and any witnesses or physicians that may be present during the completion of it. We generate a human readable PDF, and we populate that using a library called PDF Box. We also digitally sign that human readable document with the custodian's cert, and that is actually attached to the FHIR consent on completion. There's an opportunity in there for the patient or the person completing the questionnaire to review and accept and validate it. In the case of advanced care directives, there's a optional notary flow. That's where they may capture the information related to the questionnaire and then print it out and go have it signed and then allows them to upload and attach it to the FHIR consent at a later time. The end result of all of this within the LEAP consent management UI is the generation of a questionnaire response, which is linked to the FHIR consent through an R4 extension, and then the generation of provenance, where we target the patient's consent and reference the questionnaire response. During this Connectathon track for consent management, decision enforcement services, and computable consent, we've got a suite of use cases that we are testing. We're testing patient privacy, advanced care directives, informed consent for treatment, informed consent for participating in research, and as well as DNR and portable medical order. So we've got test messages and an orchestration suite for testing the actual consent that's created. I'm going to go ahead and drop out. Any questions at this point? Okay, we're now going to go over and take a look at the consent repository here. So I'm going to share another screen. So we have a project, a GitHub repository that has all of the services and source code available to you. This is an open source project. It was funded by ONC. And so this is available to you to enhance or use as an educational tool. I would probably start by going to our documentation artifacts. So we have a documentation website via GitHub. It kind of breaks down each of the functional areas of our project. The core cornerstone of the LEAP consent project is the LEAP consent decision service. And so you can navigate to that source code. This is a node implementation. It implements both a CDS hooks and XACML interface for those of you that have worked in access control over the years. And there's some examples as far as how to generate those requests and so forth. So start with in your review, start with the LEAP CDS consent decision service. And then the UI that we're actually going to exercise during this demonstration is the LEAP consent management UI. This is a Vaadin implementation. It's pure Java. The models inside of it were based on the state of Arizona and their requirements for advanced care directives. It utilizes a patient population that was generated through Cynthia for the state of Arizona, and the demographics are, for the most part, age 50 and above, because a lot of the advanced care directives like living will and power of attorney are applicable in this area. The tool was created for that, but it's not limited to Arizona. In other words, you can extend it to include the forms and the flows for other states as well. We use CI/CD, continuous integration in the Google Cloud. So as we update this is continuously deployed and available for you to test against. And then we have some examples of actual implementations of orchestration with other subsystems within the LEAP project. So we've got a consent enforcement service. It's based on a FHIR proxy. And then we have one that's actually embedded within the FHIR implementation. It acts as a interceptor, and each one of those we talk about how these things are done. And there's additional documentation within those repos. We've got use cases for orchestrating and enforcing interactions between B2 messages, e-health exchange where we are exchanging consolidated CDAs between organizations. So there's good examples in how to implement those services where we're utilizing the tools of the LEAP project. Let's see, get back to the next one. Security labeling service. This kind of ties into another track. We have a limited edition implementation of a security labeling service that we utilize within the LEAP consent management service for patients to analyze their record. I'll actually go through that today. So we've implemented an SLS. This is available to you. It has parsers associated for V2 messages, consolidated CDA, and FHIR. And then the last one is a Java library. This allows you to plug that client into the any implementation, typically your consent enforcement service that would allow you to communicate with LEAP's consent decision service, passing requests and interpreting the responses or the authorization results, such as permit, deny, or permit with obligations. So this is a good look at the what's available to you as far as example code goes that was developed via the LEAP project. So let's go into the LEAP consent UI. This is the one that we're going to focus mostly on in this session. So the LEAP consent UI is a suite of services designed to help the patient create patient privacy, advanced care directives, post, informed consent for treatment and research type consents. We've got, you can go through, and this is just kind of a high level overview of how to build it. Again, this is running inside of the Google Cloud. This is the overall architecture. Kind of goes through a high level view of what each functional area is within the consent management UI. It makes the assumption in this that everybody's in the room, right? That we're all, the patients in the room and their legal representatives in some case are in the room, and we're all utilizing this tool to create those consents. That probably isn't the case now with COVID. You know, a nice thing would be to be able to extend this where we have some kind of remote video capability that ties everybody in. And there's been some discussions about that as an enhancement to these capabilities. But really, this is patient focused, everyone's in the room, and we're just going through these questionnaire flows. As far as examples within the LEAP consent management UI, let's go to test scripts. For the FHIR Connectathon, we have example consents. These were actually generated through the UI. for our demo patient one. So we've got a living will example of a FHIR consent. We have a power of attorney for healthcare, power of attorney for mental health, a do not resuscitate, a patient privacy consent where we're exchanging data between that patient's primary clinic and the healthcare information exchange. We've got consent and a consent example for post or the portable medical order. For informed consent, we have a clinical trial that's occurring inside of the state of Arizona for people with pre-diabetes condition. And then we have an informed consent for treatment where the physician wishes to attain consent to prescribe a antidepressant. So these are good working examples that are being generated from the Leave Consent Management UI. And then later on, we'll actually go through and look at how these things are enforced. Any questions at this point? Okay. So additional to that, in our use cases, I have test for each one of our 23 test cases. We have example authorization requests. And these are the requests that are sent to the Leave Consent decision service. All of them are in the form of a CDS hooked implementation. So where we're passing in a request context of the patient ID. This is the identifier within the patient's resource record, not the FHIR identifier. This is an identifier like social security number or driver's license or whatever. The category that we're requesting here, patient privacy, the purpose of use, which is an array, in this case, treatment, and who's actually making the request or the recipient of that data. So the actor involved in that request, okay? And then as well, oops, sorry, jumped it. I've created a postman collection to actually exercise these in an interactive fashion and evaluate the response, and we'll go through that today as well. So that covers our testing for this track. Any questions at this point? Okay. So let's go ahead and jump in. Here's our Happy FHIR server. Currently, we have 14 consents out there, and I think most of those are for demo one. One thing we want to cover here, actually, let's just go to the UI and let's take a look at demo one and what we have. Oops. Hold on for a sec. Let me finish that. That looks right. There we go. Okay, so can everybody see my screen? Okay. So this is our demo user one. And I've already completed the consents available. We've gone through each one of the possible use cases, and we've created consents for each one of those. So this patient, demo one, Lorena, has an advanced care directive for living will, power of attorney healthcare, mental health, DNR, pulse treatment, research, and a HIA exchange for patient privacy. The way the tool works, this is a listing of all of my consents. I can click on it. And at this point, I can revoke that consent. In the case of an ACD, you revoke it, you cannot reinstate it. You have to recreate it. The attachment for that consent, the human readable portion of it, is attached to the FHIR consent in the document area, and we can see what was completed here. So this is a way of, this is my repository for a specific patient. So let's go and actually log out and log in. Let's create some consents. And we know that demo 2 doesn't have any. So we've created 10 test users, demo 1 through 10. All of them have a common password for demonstration purposes. So this is Russell. So Russell has no consents, right? We have a section down here called notifications. And this is an experimental area within the LEAP consent management framework. But basically, it's a suite of rules that execute to determine what kinds of consents might be needed for a given patient. So I've got it, since my patient population in Arizona is 50 and above that we've loaded, I've created a rule that basically says that some of these consents should be created. This is an arbitrary rule on my part, but it's something that we could use to drive what a patient needs to work on. So we've got a patient privacy, which requires a minimum of an exchange policy between your primary provider's organization and the healthcare information exchange. And in this case, that healthcare information exchange in Arizona is Health Current. So then it drops me into share my data. And I'm going to go through the questionnaire. There's a date requirement for this patient privacy consent. So I'm going to select a year. It has the ability to limit access to specific FHIR resources. So I'm going to say that I don't want to share my family history, my body type, body structure, what else? My insurance plan, related, my relatives, related persons within my record. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to share it from my primary provider, which is Mariposa. And I'm going to allow the exchange of that information to Health Current. And then it asks me if I want to remove sensitive data. Well, wait a minute. How do I know if I have sensitive data in my record? Well, we have a tool in here that actually uses a small implementation of the security labeling service to identify whether a patient has sensitive data. So let's hop out of this. Let's not complete this share, and let's go and look at what I can do here. So this is based on the HL7 security labeling service. It allows me to analyze V2 messages or consolidated CDAs in XML form, or actually go out and look at my clinical record if I have access through a FHIR API at my healthcare information exchange. So I'm just going to upload a test example. So this is a V2 message that I have that has alcohol abuse in. I've uploaded it. I'm going to process it. And it shows that I do have sensitive information in here. I've run it through the SLS, and it's found a situation where I have alcohol abuse. Okay, but what if I have a CDA that's a consolidated care record or a summary of episode? No. Well, I can bring that in. Where's it at? Alcohol abuse. I guess I built this one. And I can process that as well. And we can see a bunch of different issues related to my alcohol issues. So I do know that I have sensitive information within my clinical record, and I probably want to do something about them. So I'm going to go ahead and let's go back to share my data. I'm going to select a year. I can also do a custom date range. Again, I want to deny body structure, family members, my insurance plan. I'm setting it from my primary, which is Mariposa, and I'm allowing Health Current, the HIE, to get access to that information. Now I do know that I have privacy concerns, and by default, we go ahead and eliminate anything. The SLS will tell us if we have substance abuse, HIV, mental health related issues, sickle cell anemia, sexually transmitted disease, etc. It will tag those as restricted. And the CDS, the lead consent CDS has implemented one obligation, and that obligation is to redact. There are other possible obligations, but to redact, in this case, sensitive information or specific classes of data like body structure. So we're going to go ahead and create this. Russell's going to sign it. So we're capturing his electronic signature. Oops, let's cancel that. We haven't, oh yeah, well, that's a bug. So I just started the service and we haven't loaded all the components. So let me get back in there. Okay, let's go through this real quick. Body structure, family insurance. Okay, so now let's go through the signature flow. It's going to generate the human readable portion of this for patient privacy. And so we've got a date when this consent will be enforced. The patient does not authorize the release of family member history, body structure, or insurance plan. The custodian of the information is Community Health Center, and its destination, or the requester, the actor in this, is Health Current. And I do want to remove STD, sickle cell anemia, HIV, mental health related, or substance abuse type disorders. I'm going to go ahead and submit that. Okay. And so this should show up in my repository, my record within the consent repository. We can see that record. Okay. If we go look at the FHIR piece of that, let's just do a search. Okay, let's read this. This is our most recently created one. So this is what the consent looks like for patient privacy. So the consent UI just created patient privacy, category of patient privacy. It is active. It has a link to the questionnaire response, and we'll go to that. Actually, let me go back. This is actually a better view of it. There we go. Okay, so this is my first consent that I created for patient Russell. It's active. It has a link to the questionnaire response. So we have the ability to actually look at what questions were responded to by Russell. it's looking at use the default date option of 1 year. You can see it's a true. This is calculating start and end date. It's selected from a list of constraints. It's constraining family history, body structure, insurance plan. The organization that's the custodian organization was Mariposa. The recipient is held current. It wants to remove all sensitive information. True. And then it's basically we captured that the signature was captured and it was signed by the patient. Okay. If we look at the rules that were actually created in this, there is a default policy. So the ONC's leave consent management system has a default for patient privacy, creates a default rule that of type permit for the given period that the patient requested, if the purpose of use of that request is treat or e-treat, okay? And then based on the constraints that the patient identified within the flow, for health current, I want to redact family history, body structure, and insurance plan. And I want to deny access as well to down here in the security label area. I want to deny access based on a confidentiality code of R. Any questions on that?
Dwayne, I have a question. I don't know if it's a little bit more foundational than this. I'm new to consent, and what I understand is a consent is a coincidence of certain items that a patient or anybody wants to give access to some other actors, right? So you said, for example, I want to give consent to medication, to see my medications, my allergies, and this and that. Now, those items that I'm giving consent to, and those actors like insurance, like family members, where do these items come from? Is it from an internal repository each company or system or enterprise has, or there is a standard with those?
So the actors that participate in FHIR consent, in the case of this implementation, they have to be known to the consent repository. Because what's happening here, so if we were to look at, let's go and actually take a look at the participants here. So we know that, well, actually, let's come back here. So the organization, the custodian of this consent is actually is Mariposa, and Mariposa is known within the consent repository. Okay, so this is the actor that's actually delivering the data, and then Health Current is also known within the consent repository as an organization for the receipt of that information. So in this implementation, we have to know about these actors, right? It's not an arbitrary thing. So we have, if I was to go through the consent management system and say I wanted to grant access to a specific member in my family, that I would have to be able to create that related person. It can be a related person in the consent repository, so I can associate that reference with this consent. So when we go through, and that person makes that request and asserts their identity, which should map to that related person, that I can actually grant that request. Otherwise, it should fail, right? But in the case of patient privacy, since a large number of organizations have implemented an opt-in type model, or policy, that our first rule is that if you are a known organization and you assert that the purpose of this request is for treatment or emergency treatment, that you're going to be granted access to this data. And in the consent that we're looking at now, we're saying that is true for Health Current, but the patient wishes to redact specific information, portions of that record within that exchange. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah. Is there any way
Can I just
you could
add one thing on
please
there?
paste? Could you please paste the link to that tool if it's accessible to everybody in the chat, so I can take a look at it later?
Oh, sure.
So just to kind of add on
Thank
to
you.
what you're just saying, though, it sounds like there's an assumption that you're linking your consent engine to your scopes as well, right? Within your authentication authorization process. Is that correct?
Can you expand on that?
Yeah.
Right. So if you're allowing a member to go in and to redact access to certain information based on maybe the sensitivity of information, or at a I'll say at a resource level, you would have to. I would think you would want to make sure that you're keeping track of that information during the enrollment or during the registration process, or when the person's on, giving the authentication authorization, so they can go in and check, like, yes, I want to give, this organization read access to patient.read, or maybe certain resources, right? So I'm just trying to make sure I'm making the connection between what the patient elects or what the member elects versus the consent piece, right? There's the scopes of the data that you're giving access to, and there's what you're consenting to give access to.
Mohammed, do you want to take that?
I'm still having a hard time actually navigating the question.
So Dwayne, this is
Okay,
this is
let me rephrase the
sorry.
question then, right? So let me rephrase that, right? So let's say that the member goes on to they go through the Smart FHIR sequence, and they get directed to their authentication authorization screen. They're at the authorization screen, and the payer happens to pop up, hey, do you want to give access to data? And you're basically saying yes, but they give you the ability to go down to this to apply the scopes. So do you want to give access to patient.read or patient.star.read condition? And maybe you only want to give access to certain attributes within condition, and you only want to give read access, right? So when you get down to that level, you're now creating the scopes in which are going to be passed through the JOT. Those scopes also align to the consent of the data, right? Which also could potentially tie into the sensitivity of the data, right? Because the sensitivity is something that you're capturing in the metadata. So I just want to see, or try to understand, are you making assumptions that your scopes are tied into your consent, or are they separate and someone has to make that?
Right. So I think now I understand the question finally. So what you're describing is like how the consent decision service would be integrated and fit in with the authorization process in this case, for instance, the smart authorization process. And that is something that is kind of like a future work for us to actually implement that integration into like an OAuth service generically, or a particular OAuth service that is serving Smart FHIR. So what we are talking about is like a layer underneath that, where the consent decision is one portion of among other factors that could factor into an access control system, like an OAuth access control system, right? There is definitely the mapping between what we allow in a consent resource and what is allowed in the form of OAuth scopes, right? Whether they're like version 1 or version 2, which is a little bit more complicated. So that mapping needs to be handled by the access control system, because what the consent resource allows to be articulated in the provisions is not exactly the same as smart scopes. Smart Scopes version 1 are pretty rough and high level, and then Smart Scopes version 2 are very, very fine grained into like search parameters. So the mapping there is not trivial, and it needs to be implemented by the access control system. And we have not made that integration ourselves. This is not part of our mission, although we have identified that integration as a future work. And I wanted to see if Dwayne wants to add to this, and then.
No, I think we need to move on because we're almost at the hour here.
All right.
So,
Jason, did you want to just have a minute to?
Yeah, one last kind of, real quick. So what's the assumption where you're capturing the consent then? That's maybe I missed that in an earlier part of the session. So if you can just clear that up for me.
So the consent, as far as the consent decision services is involved, the consent can come from any source. As far as it's a FHIR consent, like complying to that standard, the consent decision service can understand it and incorporate it into this decision process. And then in the consent management interface here, the outcome is ultimately a FHIR consent resource. So all of these things are basically, they're being translated into a questionnaire response, thereby into a FHIR consent resource. So I hope that addresses the question that you raised.
It does. I think we can move on. I have a lot more questions, but let's move on.
Absolutely. And we can continue once we're at the top of the hour. After the session is over, we can continue to have a breakout session and have that conversation.
And Dwayne and Mohammed, this is Seth Proctor. May I just add just one other data point here that may help for Jason?
Please go ahead.
So I think, Jason, for context, I'm working on a similar problem. It's a different project, but I think the approach that's being taken here makes a lot of sense. The way I'd characterize this as, think about what's going on here as something that's complementary, right? There are things that can be expressed very well in scopes. There are other things that are more contextual or not explicit consents to a given entity that can assert some identity, but are just simply consents. For example, these advanced directives that we're looking at here, right? And so these are kind of the way the model that forms from like the XACML abstraction that they're using is that there's a front end place where you query and you can put kind of arbitrary attributes about what's driving a query into the request that's being made, and you can get back kind of deeper color about why a decision is being made and kind of what your obligations are against it. And so in a smart system where you're using OAuth scopes, like that might be part of the input to this, to be able to say, I understand I've been explicitly granted read access to a piece of data or write access. I also want to know if this action is permissible. And that's going to go to a backend repository where someone's built these consents to be able to make these decisions that aren't about what you would express in a scope. So I'd see those as like both important pieces that you want to be able to get kind of the whole life cycle of how you work with this data.
Thanks. Yep. So I want to let Dwayne finish the presentation of what was on the agenda for this meeting, and then we can continue to keep this call going, and we'll have follow-up conversations as a breakout. So please stay around if you can, and we can continue that conversation. Sorry, Dwayne, back to you.
Yeah, sorry. And I'm sorry, but I want to make sure that the people have allocated this hour, that they get to see the testing portion of this. So we just created a consent for Russell, our patient Russell. And this is basically an example of testing that or exercising that. So we've got a CDS hooks request where we've established the context of Russell's social security number. This is a category for patient privacy and with the purpose of use of treatment. And this is just a known organization. This is not health current. This is just a known organization. So I go ahead and I send that. This is going to go talk to CDS. It comes back with a response. And it sees that I do have based on a consent. This is my default consent that I've created for patient privacy, that default rule that allows me to receive a consent permit. Okay, so that's a permit on that. But let's look at health current. So I'm going to go ahead and let me change the social security number to Russell's. because we put some constraints on health current, what they get to receive, right? So I'm going to say that, send it. So we should see some obligations here, right? So we do. So we see that we get a consent permit because we've met that default rule criteria, but we also have some obligations. And we can see that we've implemented here the redact, and it's looking for redact family member history, body structure, insurance plan, and anything with a confidentiality of restricted. When we say confidentiality restricted, it's restricted or very restricted. We capture that upper level thing. But what if we were to ask for specific data classification? I just want to look at your body structure, right? But remember, we constrained that in the request. So, oops, where's my patient ID? So I'm gonna do that. Save it, send. This case, we're gonna get a deny. So we're asking something that is specifically denied within the provision unique to that exchange between Mariposa and Health Current, right? So we're saying that we're going to get a deny because we're asking for body structure. Body structure is constrained within the patient's privacy consent. And so the CDS responds to that, and with a consent deny tells us, this is based on this baseline consent. Okay. So you see what happens with what's actually happening. We're creating that consent. We're creating the FHIR resource. The CDS consumes that FHIR consent resource and is able to determine or to make some decisions based on it, based on the provisions within the FHIR consent resource. There's your computable consent, right? I can make decisions off of what the patient wanted. So how much time more time do we got? 8 minutes. Let's just do a quick. So in this notification flow, you can see we've completed patient privacy. There's other options in here. They're more complex. Let's do a DNR real quick. Do we even have it? Yeah, here we go. This is just an example of another category. So Russell up front within this flow, it needs Russell's signature up front. If there's a representative, we can capture that. You can, in some cases, they want you to upload photos. I'm not going to do that of the individual, but we've got the physical characteristics of the patient, their physician, who's part of this process, Dr. Bob Smith. Whether or not that patient's in hospice. The doctor's signature. A signature of a witness, in this case, John Dayton. And again, if you notice here, we've got a different form. We're interjecting these values from the patient's information coming out of the FHIR resource, as well as what's captured in the questionnaire. This is what the DNR form looks like for the state of Arizona. I could go through the accept and notarize, which I could then print this out and get it signed by a notary. I'm going to go ahead and accept and submit. It's created that resource. It's a little bit different now on the FHIR side, what that consent looks like. Let's go. Because it's got a different base rule or a base policy. And this policy is you don't get access to a DNR, period, You have to assert certain things, right? So let's look at that consent that I just created. Okay, so this is a DNR for a specific patient. We've got an ID, categories DNR.
I don't know if we're seeing the right screen.
Oh, I am so sorry. Yeah, that would be a problem. Let me share my other screen here. Sorry about that. Share. Okay, so you missed me actually creating it. Here's the DNR. Okay, this is the DNR that I just created for this patient. And if we look at the FHIR portion of that, the FHIR consent, we've got a questionnaire response. So it basically goes through all the responses by the patient. It's a pretty short questionnaire response. Okay. Let's go back. We see that its base rule for this period of time, which defaults to 10 years, it looks like, is deny, and that the person or the requester has to be able to assert emergency treatment or treatment to get access to this. So let's go back. So let's stop here and share our test thing again. Okay, and I want to grab this guy. And let's go to one of our tests for DNR. Send it. So I'm requesting the existence of a do not resuscitate if it exists within the system. And it does come back with consent permit, and it tells me what the consent is with the based on response. If I was to request a DNR information where it's not, where we assert some other purpose of use for this patient, I should get a deny. And I do. And it's based on the consent that was created for that patient. So just a quick coverage point. This is true in most cases, like ACD or advanced care directives, DNR, a lot of those MPOLs, there's a base policy of deny. You don't get access to it unless you can assert specific purposes of use and you're a known entity within the system. All right, so let's do one more. We got 2 minutes. Let's do a treatment and informed consent. So share screen. These consents are largely experimental. Informed consent, I take an example of a physician who wants to prescribe, in this case, Zoloft to our patient. It does require informed consent. This is the corresponding. So this is touching a medication request within the FHIR clinical record, where this patient, this physician has put this prescription on hold, waiting for consent, which I don't agree with the statusing of these, the medication request to support consent. So there's some open issues. So the patient is presented with an informed consent about an SSRI. and possible side effects. We capture that they do in fact consent to it. So this is Russell. And the physician signs it as well. And it generates the human readable portion of that, where we talk about side effects and the patient acknowledges that they've discussed this with the physician and I consent to this treatment, accept that. You see now in the record, we have a treatment, informed consent for treatment. The custodian of this consent, since it is managing the consent repository, is Health Current. So if we go and stop sharing, and if we go to test that, Postman, let's look at, okay, so author, there we go. So we have a specific author here. Let me get that. We'll test that real quick. Okay, so basically with this informed consent, this allows the requesting physician to continue down that process. So if I go back, stop sharing, I'm really sorry about having to bounce around here. Share. If we look at that medication request, we should see that this is now active in the system so the physician can prescribe it, but I can choose to revoke that at any time. So I can take that treatment and I can revoke that consent, okay, which shows up in another status here for this patient. If I go back to notifications, we should see that no longer, that it's been, yeah, it's removed from my list, okay? If I go to run the request again, the same treatment request, and I send it, I get no consent. No consent, in other words, I revoke that consent. So there's no longer a viable consent for that medication request, that any action of that would stop, assuming that there's checks occurring within this flow, that if they went to the authorization service, it would say no consent. No consent is the same as a deny, okay, in your workflow. So any questions on that? That's a lot to cover in an hour. I'm sorry about having to jump around a lot. So this pretty much ends this portion of this session. And I think we can open it up to questions at this point.
I was just going to make a comment. This is more on use cases of what you're talking about from a medication consent or not consent. This kind of falls along, I'm thinking some of the processes, not just for like surgical consents or procedural consents. Are you getting into that aspect as well? Or is that something totally different?
We didn't have an opportunity to get into that. We wanted to address how this fits into the flow. And I don't know if you've gone up and looked at the flows for the flows. If you look at medication requests and the status codes associated with that, or service requests within the resources, they don't really lend themselves to like, informed consent required. You don't see something like that. When in reality, we need to be able to identify, like I think you posted an example for Accutane. We need a way of plugging in how this authorization event would occur within that flow. And I think that's missing right now.
Yeah,
And then-
just as a clinician, that's one thing, as looking at the total workflow. And I think this is really great ideas that you're working towards. And again, I'm newer to your work here, but there, I think, does exist a need for some way of documenting either a agreement by the patient, whether you call that a consent by the patient, and it uses this consent resource, or and then how conceptually does that differ from to your point, the quote informed consent of some things require legally that informed consent right now, right? You see it typically in consent for a surgery or a procedure or a blood transfusion or things like that, and the more common use cases. But you see it more anecdotally in clinical practice, where for some of these more high risk, either medications or things like that, that the clinician wants to be able to document that they really did discuss, all of this with the patient, and some places will create their own little form, right? And then have the patient sign it, and then they'll upload it into the EHR.
Right.
Where what you're trying to design is a infrastructure by which it could use computable information to do that.
Absolutely. Because to be honest with you, consent without the ability to enforce it is not necessarily meaningful, right? So it has to be able to plug into that workflow within that process, right? And right now, I don't think, and it relies on, to be able to plug into that workflow, it relies on being able to have status, technically to have status codes that are meaningful. Because in this case, we're keying off of the status code. We're assuming that you don't get to do this, complete this prescribing of this medication, which is currently the status of on hold, which doesn't really mean anything to me from an authorization standpoint. It's on hold for what, right?
Yeah, and in the clinical workflow, there's medications are put on hold and off hold a lot of times for different reasons.
Right.
You go down for surgery, it's put on hold for that and things like that. So, and I'm not, familiar with this specific build and FHIR for these concepts, but that's where there really needs to be, I'm going to say, more of a standard related to what these terms mean, so that there can be appropriate information. Because if you were to just take that concept and say every time it comes and says on hold, and the clinical implementations across the country are using the medication on hold for whatever reason things, you're going to throw up a whole lot of confusion because you're using the same term for different reasons.
Right. And that's why for informed consent for treatment, regardless if it's medication request or service request, and also research studies, both of those use cases I treated as experimental. In fact, in the previous Connectathon, basically I said, we're not there yet. because these are largely not implementable for exactly that reason. So there is a lot of work that needs to be. Any other questions or comments? Well, this has been a really good session, guys. I'm sorry about having to bounce around a lot. See if I can improve that during the demonstrations, but thanks for attending.
Thank you so much, Dwayne.
Okay. And we'll see you this afternoon. We're just going to have a short touch point at, I think it's 3 p.m. No, it must be
I think it's 4.
4 p.m. Eastern time.
We'll
Thank you
have a
so
session
much.
at 4 p.m. We can follow up the conversation, Jason and the other gentleman that was speaking about details of how to integrate the with OAuth and Smart and FHIR. That would be a conversation we could have later on today. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be good. Great.
Sure.
Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
I'll try to make sure I'm there. Sorry, this is Jason. I'll try to make sure I'm there. If not, Ezekiel, who actually is on my team, I'll try to make sure he is there as well.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks.
Bye.
Thank you all.